Hello, my name is Ari. Welcome back to my podcast, Surrounded by Addicts. Here I share my perspective on alcohol and drug addiction as someone who comes from a family of addicts. I share my personal stories, lessons I learned along the way, and take a look at what the research says about addiction. Please enjoy the following episode. Since I already did an episode talking about my relationship with my drunkle, I thought it'd be fair and sort of insightful to talk about what I know about how he grew up, sort of how he came to be the person that I met, that I got to know, the person that I see as my drunkle. So, to start off, he is the youngest brother out of a total of five siblings. He does have a younger sibling, but that's my aunt. So she was the only girl and the baby of the family. Um, my drunkle's father, who I'll call Ted. Ted, from what I understand, was a very abusive man who was also drunk. He was also a drunk, I should say. Now, the dynamic is interesting because my grandmother, she had two kids that were much older than my drunkle, 10 to 15 years older than him. And then her third kid was adopted. That third kid is my father, Jim, who, if you didn't listen to previous episodes, I just referred to as Jim. So Jim was adopted, and at first he was raised by his older brother's father because that's who adopted him with my grandmother. Jim was adopted at a very young age. Jim was adopted, as far as I know, between 2 to 4 months old. So Jim knew this other man as his dad. And then somewhere down the line, my grandmother divorces that man and she remarries to Ted. I don't know how old Jim was when Ted is in the picture, but I just know at some point that's who his quote unquote father is from that point on. He did still know the ex husband because that was his brother's biological dad, but the person that he lived with was Ted and his mother. So, from what I understand and what I've been told, Ted really took out a lot of his anger on my father, Jim, who did not have the most confidence in himself, did not know how to speak up for himself, did not know how to just not let Ted get under his skin. Jim had a very difficult time with that for a multitude of reasons, some of which he was born with, some of which Ted kind of drilled into his head. Again, all from what I've been told and what I understand. So, my drunkle is now born, and as I've mentioned in a previous episode, drunkle and Jim are about 13-ish years apart. So, my drunkle gets to see the poor treatment that Ted was doing to Jim. And he felt very protective over his older brother. I think it was mainly because he just felt bad for him. But Drunkle and Jim were always very close, kind of because of this, because of the abuse that they faced from Ted. Ted was very verbally abusive and also physically abusive to everybody in the house, not just Jim, but to everybody. Drunkle grew up always playing defense and offense for his mom and for his baby sister. Whenever Ted got too mouthy, he would argue with him. Whenever Ted was threatening to hurt my grandmother or my aunt, who's even younger than my drunkle would be the one to face him. And this was a routine habit for them. And it was mainly because Ted was drinking. Since there was a big age gap between Drunkle and Jim, I don't know how much Jim was actually around to see this, to witness this. Did he help? Did he not help? Did he live with them? I don't really know where Jim was. I just know that for a part of Jim's childhood, Ted put him under a lot. And then by the time my drunkle is at a certain age, it's my drunkle mainly bearing the brunt of what Ted was doing. And I was told by multiple people that Ted and Drunkle would frequently get into fights because, like I said, Ted would get drunk, he would become physically abusive, and Drunkle would try to protect his mom and his sister, and he would fight. So, right off the bat, from a very early age, my drunkle had a very aggressive, mean drunk in his life. He suffered a lot in that way because of just how his father was. Probably not a surprise, but to this day, he hates his father. He absolutely despises Ted. No one really likes him. No one does. Most people that could be in Ted's life choose to avoid him for good reason, But my uncle especially hates him. Don't blame him, but he was put through a lot as a child. And I think bearing the brunt of being the protector, feeling like if he didn't do it, no one else would, I think Drunkle was put under a lot of pressure, an incredible amount of pressure. He had the weight of keeping his family safe from their own husband slash their own father. So he was forced to be put in a role that he was too young for. And I think just that pressure alone made it easier for him to cope with drugs and alcohol. When I say drugs, for the most part, I mean just weed, especially when he was younger, like teenagerhood. I mainly just refer to as weed. I'm sure he dabbled in other things, but for the most part, I'm referring to weed and then, of course, booze. So I can totally understand how Drunkle started to become, Drunkle, because just being put in the role of guardian, protector, and fighter for your own family because of your own drunk dad, that I can only imagine what that could do to a person. But that's the role that he had. Jim was still in the picture. I just don't know how much he was. Because, as I said, Jim, when it came to dealing with other people, was kind of a pussy. Um, he was very timid. Despite his size and his stature, he was not the type of person to do well with confrontation. Unless it was with me. If it was with me, he had no problem popping off. But with other people, especially people that he felt threatened by, he wasn't going to say much. So, not only was Drunkle protecting his older mother and his youngest sibling, but he was also protecting Jim. Ted did and said some fucked up things to Jim, and Drunkle saw that. Drunkle saw how evil Ted was being and how emotionally beaten down Jim was, which is why he had no problem protecting him. We did see Drunkle here and there for family parties and things like that, and every time we were at a family gathering, them two would just be drinking. They were built-in drinking buddies, and I think it just has so much to do with how they grew up, the dynamic of the older brother needing to be protected from the father, so the younger brother stepped in. I think Ted knew that Jim was emotionally more vulnerable than Drunkle, so that's why he was able to tear down Jim in a different way than how he teared down Drunkle. And this dynamic of younger brother saving the older brother is what, in my opinion, started this weird relationship, in my opinion, that they had. What I mean by weird is around 14 to 15, that's when Jim started to provide booze for Drunkle. I obviously was not there for this, and even if I was born, I was way too young to remember. So this is from multiple people telling me what their dynamic was like. And some of it was from my drunkle's mouth himself after Jim passed. But from a very young age, Jim was buying him booze, very much out in the open, not really hiding it. So, yes, they did bond over booze. It's kind of ironic, I guess, when you think about it, that the person that did the most damage to the both of them, Ted, was a drinker, and then they kind of bonded over that same activity, kind of like they were reclaiming what booze meant to them instead of it meaning like abuse, destruction, chaos, something bad. They were trying to reclaim it as a bonding activity, which is what it, in my opinion, clearly became. Now, Drunkle is getting older. Jim is getting older. This is around the time where I'm actually born or on the way. I don't know how close their relationship was when I was first born. I know there's baby pictures of me both with my drunkle and with my aunt, but I don't know how much they saw us when I was, between ages 0 to 2. I don't really know. I know that Drunkle throughout his high school career admitted to always being on something. He was always smoking weed, he was always drinking, and it was just part of his daily life. Even after he graduated, it was the same thing. He was actually really smart. My drunkle is a very smart man. As far as academics, he did excel. He did very well in school. So I don't want anybody to get it wrong that he was just some dumb drunk that was just barely passing. As far as I've been told, he excelled very well in school. And that was one of the things that I think people were surprised by the most, because people knew that he was under the influence, but because he was doing so well, they just didn't know how to handle it because, well, what can you say? Yeah, he's getting high or he's drinking, but he's passing with flying colors, so how do you handle that? As far as I understand, the people that knew that he had a problem, or at the very least, was doing shit he wasn't supposed to because of his age, they didn't know what to do about it. One, because he was doing really well in high school, and two, I think they kind of felt like they owed him. Because Drunkle protected his family when he was younger, they kind of let him do what he wanted for the most part, because he stepped up when nobody did. So the least they could do was turn a blind eye to his drinking habits or his smoking habits. My drunkle kind of became untouchable. He stepped up against Ted when nobody else could. He became sort of the handyman around the house because no one else could. And he was doing good in school. So no one was going to tell him what to do about his drinking habit because he had everything else in his life going good for him. That's just my speculation. I could be completely wrong, but from me growing up around them and talking to different people, it seems to me that is at least part of why his drinking habit just grew and grew far beyond what anybody wished it would. So now we're getting to his early-ish 20s. So at family parties, Drunkle and Jim were just two peas in a pod. They would drink right away, catch up right away. I can't really remember a time at a family party where they weren't together. It was always them two together. So again, as adults, that's how they bond. They bond over booze, like referenced before, kind of reclaiming the activity of drinking and associating it with bonding. Or maybe they couldn't tolerate their normal personalities, so they had to They had to drink away their personalities and then hang out, whatever perspective you want. And this would include the other older brother as well. They have two older brothers, and one of them we saw more often because of where he lived. The other older brother would also join in these activities, but just focusing on them two would always be drinking together. And then with the problems going on between Jim and my mom, God knows how Jim was wording it. Jim definitely lied about a couple of things. I won't get into what exactly he lied about because it's just getting to the nitty gritty of the whole custody battle, and I don't want to misremember something, anyways. But Jim was definitely lying about some of the things my mom was doing or my mom's situation. So naturally, Drunkle became a little bit protective over what Jim was going through, especially because I was alive. I'm a living person that my Drunkle is seeing, and in his perspective, he sees it as my mom is trying to rip me away from Jim, which she kind of was, but if you listen to previous episodes, you can understand why. So, nonetheless, we end up living with Drunkle. The two people that have the biggest drinking problems are living in the same house together. And oh, they just fed off of each other. They, as far as I can remember, if Jim was drunk, you could guarantee Drunkle was drunk, and vice versa. Now, just even though there was a big age gap, Jim wasn't doing extremely well for himself. He had a lot of issues that he was struggling to work through. And my Drunkle being in his early 20s, being at that perfect party age, it kind of worked out for the both of them to drink together. And then Jim got sent to rehab, and I was alone. Well, not alone. I lived with a bunch of people, but as far as the person that ties me to where I live, he's gone. I grew up knowing who my grandmother was, and I grew up knowing who my aunt and uncle was, but it was weird being there without the person that brought me there. Like, I felt very out of place. And Drunkle probably knew that. Drunkle could probably tell that even though I was internally happy that Jim was gone, he could probably tell that it was off just coming home and not seeing, Jim, who at the time I would say my dad. So Drunkle and he started to maybe not hang out with me incredibly more or a lot more because he still had his own thing going on, but he would make more effort to talk to me and get to know what I'm doing and just to get to know me as like a little third grader, get to know who I am without Jim being there. And then a year later, that's when Jim passes away. A lot of things happened in between third grade and fourth grade when Jim passed, and I won't reiterate all of it because it's in previous episodes that I've made, but Drunkle felt extremely guilty for not being there to prevent Jim from dying. Because they were so close, because they both kind of fed into each other's addiction problems, and also because Jim was on a very obvious, a very blatant downward trajectory, Drunkle put a lot of the blame on himself, saying that if Drunkle was more supportive, Jim would still be here. If Drunkle checked in more often or went over or called him, just anything, then Jim would still be here. Everything came back down to if my Drunkle did better, Jim would still be alive, which I don't know if that would necessarily be the case, but that's what Drunkle had in his head. So Drunkle carried the burden of Jim passing ever since it happened, even though there was not much that he could have done to really prevent it, and I don't really think his involvement really would have made a difference in how Jim's story ended. Of course, that's just my perspective of it, and very clearly, my drunkle doesn't see it like that. He believes wholeheartedly that if he was more involved, he could have prevented everything from happening. And I think a big part of the reason why he carries that burden is because he is just a little bit blind to the fact that Jim wasn't the best person to be a dad. Me and him don't see eye to eye on what happened between me and Jim and just his whole life story after I was born in general. I think it would take very concrete, solid proof for Drunkle to change his mind about how he felt about Jim. The bond that they had over booze was incredibly strong, very strong. And I also feel like my drunkle thinks that Jim got the worst of how Ted treated everybody. There's a big combination of everything that caused Drunkle to be the man that he is. And as he's gotten older and older, struggling with his addiction, he doesn't even acknowledge that it is an addiction, and he is very much the type of person to act like everything is okay when everything is not okay. He is the king of sweeping things under the rug. If something happened and he knows that he was a big part of it, or if he knows you're mad at him, he will dodge bullets left and right like he's in the Matrix. He is not going to let you know that he knows that he fucked up unless you head on confront him, and then he can easily find a way to make it seem like it's your fault. So, with the combination of those two things I just mentioned, he never really did much about his drinking habit. He kind of acknowledge, like, he would acknowledge that he drinks a lot, and he would acknowledge that he's drunk a lot, but he wouldn't word it as I have a problem with it. It would just be as common as, yes, I breathe to stay alive. Yes, I'm drunk. That's what I do. That's just how he is. And now that he is closer to 40, so over 10 years has passed since his brother died, and he's been drinking for almost 30 years, like 25 years actually. Since he's been such a long time drinker, I'm not saying that it's too late for him, because I do believe that the process of recovery can start at any time. It would just take him a lot of work to get there, of course, but the compounded years of building such a normal routine habit of getting drunk every day, the connection that he had with his brother, who is now dead, and feeling guilty for what happened, but then also being responsible for the safety of his young family. There's a lot of reasons as to why Drunkle is still to this day Drunkle. There is some positive lights, I guess I can say. Um, my Drunkle is expecting his first kid, and I recently learned that the baby will be induced for a safer, more predictable birth, I should say. And he does seem to be trying to turn his life around a bit because of that. There are still issues in that relationship that I am so glad I am not a part of. So glad I do not live with them. But it does seem like the prospect of him becoming a father is, you know, might be helping him turn his ship around. So there's one positive, that the baby that is on the way, his firstborn son, might be helping him, might be the miracle baby that he needs to fix himself up. What also helped my uncle kind of thrive being a drunk is nobody really wanted to see him hit his own rock bottom. Like, yeah, we've seen him hit a lot of low points, of course, but his mom never really wanted him to get to that point of just whatever a rock bottom could be for him. Because, like I said, he has hit a lot of low points. And if none of those low points made him rethink his addiction, then what would? You know, how extreme could he get with low points? So I don't want to say that she completely enabled him because there is some personal responsibility, and it's not like he was just around my grandmother. So that's not fair to say that it was only her that enabled him. But she definitely played a role in it because she was always ready to take him back in the house. She was always, she may have been reluctant, may have complained about it, but she would always, you know, give him money, support him when he came by. If he was fighting with somebody that he was living with, he would seek refuge at her house, and then whenever her and him started to get into an argument, then he would leave again. But every job that he's had, he was able to smooth talk his way into getting it, or knew a friend, or just knew the person that could get him the job. And as long as he did a good job, they didn't care that he was drinking. Again, I'm not saying that they enabled him because he's a grown man that can make his own decisions, but every avenue of life that he decided to go through, no one really cared that he was drinking. He never really faced, he did face consequences for drinking. Like he don't got a lot of money, but nobody, you know, screamed at his face. No one really let him hear what they had to say. Everybody would just stop answering his calls or kind of ignore him. No one blatantly would come out and say that, like, your drinking is a problem or I don't like you because you drink. No one has ever really let him hear that. And I think partially because they know that he does have this ego, this confidence about him where you don't want to be confrontational because he will be confrontational right back. And because of that confidence, it can make you feel like you're wrong when in reality he knows he's in the wrong, but he can just talk his way out of that situation. So, because of how many people he knew, he had a lot of connections. He had a lot of people that he could do favors for, and then when it was their turn to repay that favor, oh, he hung it over their head. He had a lot of friends, many friends that he is smart. As I said, he is a very smart man. His wet brain has kind of taken a toll on the quickness of those skills, but he still does have them. And because of those skills, a lot of people came to him for help with a multitude of things. And every single time somebody came to him for help, they would just be indebted to him. And he was able to kind of hop from one repayment of favor to another. And he was always able to get his friends to aid in just whatever he needed because they owed him. Just there's so many little bits of a web that make up how Drunkle came to be Drunkle to this day. Like there's so many things that overlap and intertwine that it's really hard to try to unpack all of it because everything is so connected. So I guess as a too long didn't read, Drunkle from a young age was propped up to be the protector of the family because of his abusive drunk father, Ted. Ted did a lot of damage to Jim, and as Drunkle got older and he saw that Jim was emotionally and mentally weaker than him as far as being able to handle Ted's insults and verbal abuse and eventually physical abuse, Drunkle stepped in and was not only protecting his young sister and his not elder mom, but older mom, and then he also had to protect his older brother. And in my opinion, because Jim needed protection from Ted and he used Drunkle, he felt like the best way to repay Drunkle would be to supply him with booze from a very young age when my Drunkle was a teenager. And because Drunkle has always been a functioning alcoholic slash addict, he did really well in school despite doing things teenagers should not be doing. And then as he got older and older and Jim got older and older, it was easier for them to bond with booze because now people just didn't, people turned a blind eye to what they were doing. And then there was a lot of drama between my mom and Jim, and God only knows what Jim was saying to Drunkle about my mom. So Drunkle felt even more bonded to Jim because he was going through baby mama troubles. Drunkle didn't get to see me consistently throughout my younger childhood because of the custody battle. So again, there's just another thing that Jim was able to talk to Drunkle about, and I don't really have much knowledge on what exactly was said. And then Jim passes. Jim died. Drunkle has a hard time accepting that it was probably inevitable because Jim was not going in a good direction at all with his alcoholism. Drunkle refuses to acknowledge how poor of a father Jim was, sees him as an awesome guy, sees him as a drinking buddy that he would have for his whole life. That got ripped away from him. Because of the guilt that he felt, he spiraled more into drinking as a way to honor Jim, if you want to. He calls it honoring Jim, but it's just, in my opinion, more pathetic because the only way he can think of to honor his dead brother is by drinking the thing that killed him in the first place. But that's a different thing. That's a different psychoanalyzation, I guess. And then he was always able to manipulate, talk his way out of things, talk his way into things, and talk his way into getting people to help him that probably shouldn't have helped him in the first place. So he was always able to stay afloat no matter how dumb his decisions were, no matter how much he drank. He was always able to find jobs, keep money, have a place to sleep, multiple places to sleep, always able to get help to get a car, borrow money, take forever to repay it, all these things. And now that he's much older, he has a lot less friends, and his siblings were at their breaking point with dealing with him. But now he has a baby on the way. So this new chapter of life, I guess you could say, would be the true test to see what Drunkle will do. In my experience with Jim having a kid did not make a difference into how he acted. If anything, it just made him worse. So do not wish for that. I pray that won't happen to Drunkle, but we will see if Drunkle does anything different from how Jim was when Jim became a first-time dad. And that is the story of my Drunkle and how he got the nickname Drunkle. Thank you for listening to Surrounded by Addicts. Remember to take life one day at a time and to enjoy the little things in life. Stay tuned for the next episode.